Hello, we're going to take three big things that seem quite disconnected and explain why they are connected. It is Keir Starmer's attempts to reform the British state and how the government works, what might be happening with the benefits bill for people who are out of work, and Donald Trump's trade policy around the world. We will join those three massive dots on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
It's Vicki in the Newscast studio.
It's Faisal, also in the Newscast studio.
And it's Nick sitting next to Adam in the Newscast studio.
And I can't wait to find out how you're going to link the musical Hamilton, which I imagine you will be singing again, to what's been happening in the news this week. But I look forward to how that happens.
It's hard, it's tenuous, it won't work, but give it a go.
Stay tuned for that. Anyway, right, Chris Mason is not here because he's hot-footing it back from Hull, where the Prime Minister did a speech today, which was billed as kind of rewiring how government works. And then listening to this speech, the first 15 minutes of it did not feel like a massive rewiring of the state. And then we got to the big reveal at the end where the Prime Minister said he was going to abolish the UK's biggest quango, which, for those of you who don't know what that means, that's a quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation. And here is Chris's take on the quango that got axed.
Hello, newscasters from Hull. We've just heard the Prime Minister make quite a big announcement, a rewiring of the NHS in England, the abolition of NHS England, and taking what was an arm's length body into the Department of Health. And it's a big example of the overall theme that we've heard from the Prime Minister today, which is that sort of sense that government has sprouted tentacles in all sorts of different directions over years and years and years, and it's all a bit too complicated. And it means if you're the Prime Minister in Downing Street and you crank a lever of power, nothing actually happens, or it doesn't happen quickly enough. And Prime Minister quite kind of salty, quite fruity in his language about all of that, the sense of the state being too stodgy, and a frustration from him about that. Why? Because he knows that, you know, we collectively as an electorate can be quite unforgiving, times have been tough, and he needs to deliver the change that was the central word he promised back in the election campaign. And he hopes that if you rewire how the state and government works, that might be possible. But that is the big challenge, so plenty to discuss.
Now, Vicky, when I was a baby political correspondent in 2011, I remember you and I spending a lot of time reporting on the creation of NHS England, because it was Andrew Lansley, the then health secretary, who came up with it. And it caused a massive problem for David Cameron, because he then it cost him a lot of political capital to go ahead with this.
Yeah. And I think what is interesting here is that it is going back on that, isn't it? So the idea was that you have NHS England, you haven't got Whitehall dictating what happens in places.
It was taking the politics out of the health service.
Yeah, more autonomy. They were going to be innovative. Now, of course, you know, I think Jeremy Hunt today, who was, you know, then health secretary for a very long time, he was saying the problem is that's fine if the NHS is working well, everything's going to plan, innovations are happening. Of course, that isn't what has happened since. So now the idea is really to bring it all back in-house again, effectively. So you can see the upside. You know, ministers have more control. They can make decisions. They can dictate where that money goes, and there's an awful lot of that money. Of course, the downside, you could say, is then when things go wrong, there's only one person carrying the can, and that is the health secretary. So a lot of people will think, actually, in a democracy, it should be ministers who are held to account.
Do you think we should have a brief moment of sympathy for Andrew Lansley? Because I remember talking to him in the run-up to the 2010 election about his great reform plan, and I remember thinking, I don't think I really understand this. And David Cameron saying,
Cameron both.
I know, and David Cameron said, no, Andrew Lansley's doing a marvellous job, because Andrew Lansley had that job, Shadow Health Secretary, for a long time. And he did a big job of taking the Conservatives seriously on that issue. He did his reforms. And then what did David Cameron's team say in this tone of voice? We don't understand it. And they didn't understand it. And they tried to pull it back, but it was too late. And eventually it politically unravelled for them.
The thing is, though, Faisal, NHS England isn't exactly like a household name, is it?
Well, I do wonder, you do get a lot of announcements like this from this government, and it's sort of like plumbing, wiring of government quangos you probably never heard of. And it seems to be the reversal of a strategy that I thought that they were pursuing, that they liked, for example, what the Bank of England has done with its independence in setting credible interest rate policy, and that's applied in various ways. That's what I thought I heard from them about a year ago.
And they set up an independent inquiry by Louise Casey into what to do about social care.
And you get the experts, you give them a target, and they come up with a solution that you then follow. It's not just here. There's also, remember, it was a little bit more obscure, but kind of no less relevant in terms of the economic policy was what they did with the competition commissioner, who they kind of said that they fired. And you sort of wonder, well, have they just got into government, decided, actually, we do want all the joysticks of control and all the, and we want to know when to take off and when to land things and micromanage things. And there's a lot, we talk about waiting lists. One of the problems is that you go after one waiting list target and you just cause a problem somewhere else, like a giant whack-a-mole.
Because people pursue that target rather than the other one.
Yeah, so they'll be responsible for all of those trade-offs at a micro level now. But also you have a couple of big challenges coming up. You have the PFI projects, which were a Labour invention, the consequences of that as those contracts run out, are those hospitals fit for purpose? Like changes in the way the mental health, the increase in, we'll talk about this later in terms of the benefit system. There's just massive, massive challenges. Maybe it's right to be more accountable, but I'm not sure these sort of changing the way that the back office systems work is really the sort of strong change that people are looking for.
But he's tapping into a frustration, I think, isn't he? And you could feel it when he was saying it today, and it did seem to sound like he really meant this. The frustration that you hear from people all the time: nothing works properly, everything's so inefficient, this country can't build anything, all of that thing, which we heard around the planning system, where they're trying to make changes around that. And it did seem like a genuine frustration from him that, having got into power, it was like you're saying, like, you think you can do something and then actually, oh no, I'm trying to do all these things and I can't do it.
And yeah, I was chatting to Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, on Thursday's episode of Newscast, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. And I said to him, it's like, hang on, Labour's meant to be the party that represents public sector workers, and you've just fired thousands and thousands of them. How does that make you feel?
That has weighed heavily on me, because I don't think that the criticisms I'm levelling of the setup and of the bloated bureaucracy that we see is in any way a reflection on the brilliant people who work in those organisations.
Yeah, so he's having to sort of contort a little bit. But Nick, back to Vicky's point about prime ministers making this kind of speech. We've seen prime ministers making this kind of speech before, but normally it's after they've been in office for 3 years, 5 years, like 8 years, 10 years in Tony Blair's case. But this is Starmer making it within year one.
That's right. We had to wait a little bit until Tony Blair found those scars on his back and then decided to tell the world about his frustrations. We waited a bit, and, it's happened very quickly with Keir Starmer. A few months ago, do you remember he did the warm bath quote about civil servants, talking about an element of complacency? Clearly hadn't clocked how badly that would be received. And there was not exactly a rowing back, but certainly reaching out to the civil service. But some of his language was really strong today. Now, the danger of that is that in the current climate, this government, any government, will be judged at the next election on what they achieve, not what they say. So clearly what he did a few months ago was he said something. Now he's doing something which they hope and believe will make a difference. If this doesn't make a difference and they go around blaming the civil service, the electorate are not interested in that. And if anything, you might undermine your position even more if you do that.
Vicki, have you managed to get to the bottom yet of what's going to be in this reform of the benefit system that Faisal was hinting at a second ago? Because there's so much stuff floating around in the papers. There's rumours, there's MPs going into Downing Street to be briefed about what it might be and coming out and not being happy about it. What do we think is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things happening here which are related but are also causing tension. So one is, they came into power, Labour, and they had Liz Kendall put into the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, as a reformer. So there was on the agenda that they were going to change the welfare system. And, their argument is that the current system is morally indefensible. There are too many people effectively being written off as not ever being able to work, and they're on benefits and they're not being given the help to get back to work. So that was obviously on the agenda already. Then you have now a little problem with the amount of money that the Treasury is getting in, and they need to find some more. So I think what's happened here is that you've got, yes, a Secretary of State who wants to make changes, But then you've got a Treasury saying you need to make them a bit quicker because we need the money a bit quicker.
And a bit bigger.
And more than you may be expected to. So I think this is causing tension. There's briefings coming from all different places about what exactly is going to happen. There were suggestions that the savings will be between 5 and 6 billion. Important to think about how much Liz Kendall might be able to keep back in order to make the changes that are needed, and how much will be taken off to Rachel Reeves's coffers. So we're not quite sure the numbers there, but they're going to be looking at various things. They're going to be looking at universal credit, and they're going to be looking at potentially PIP, which is personal independence payments. Where that falls, I don't think we know yet, and Labour MPs haven't been given details about that yet. I was told recently that there's not going to be a freeze on PIP benefits, but of course it could be they don't go up as much as people might have expected. There's wriggle room there.
And you can see the Labour rebellion brewing. Of course, it's in a context of where for the government to lose something, the rebellion would have to be enormous.
Oh, you can see it brewing, and you can really I could detect a real change in the atmosphere this week. So, my thing is I hang around the House of Commons. I'm there at 10 o'clock when there are the votes. Often I'm the only one there because it's late at night, the only journalist there.
And the bars are shut now.
And the bars are shut. And normally what happens is you sort of go up to MPs and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? This week I had lots of MPs coming up to me, bending my ear and wanting to tell me how unhappy they are. And the thing that will be alarming the government, which is why you're getting these round table briefings in Downing Street, is this is not the campaign group on the left. These are loyalists. These are people who are really loyal to Keir Starmer. I had one newly elected Labour MP who said, isn't Keir Starmer doing absolutely brilliant on Ukraine? He's seizing the moment, but we need a reset, not happy about these welfare cuts. And then this MP said, we've got to come up with a system which allows Labour MPs to sleep at night. But the complication for them is that this is a green paper on health and disability benefits next week.
Paper being like sort of the very first stage of a reform.
Which has been in the pipeline for months. And the reason why it's been in the pipeline for months, I'm now going to say something, and we have Professor Faisal here, so he can correct me if I've got this wrong. But as I understand it, these cuts, the amount of money that has to be cut, was scored in the Red Book by the last government. What Liz Kendall is doing her way of doing it, not the Conservatives' way, and absolutely as Vicki says. So the Liz Kendall view is that the system was broken under the last government because it basically put you into a category of you can work or you can't work, and that's it. And she wants a much more flexible system. So it's her system, but the sums of money have already been scored, as I understand it. But Professor Faisal's over there. I've mentioned the Red Book in his presence. And is it right?
Well, that is part of the story. Some of these reforms were announced by the previous government, and they're going to do a version of it and probably change the name of it and continue with that. And they sort of have to, but they're going to have to make more savings than that. So we're going to get on top of that. And we're talking fairly substantial sums as well, as Vicki mentioned, 5-6 billion pounds. And that's not even all of the space that they have to make up from their self-imposed debt targets. I say have to. This is quite an interesting question now, because there is a sort of long-term reform plan that emerges from the fact that something very fundamental has changed in the British economy, which has been an increase in the prevalence of mental ill health, especially with young people. Some young people not even going into the workforce and then leaving it, but just going straight from education into some sort of incapacity or disability benefit. So some would argue from the right, they would argue, well, hang on, we never used to pay out benefits for these sorts of illnesses. This is a new thing. And you get that sort of familiar argument about, just pull your socks up is what is it that we hear in the papers quite a lot. They're obviously trying to be a lot more sensitive around these issues. But clearly that bill has gone up. Something like, I think it's 28 billion was the bill in 2019-20. It's heading, according to the OBR, to 70 billion for disability, incapacity and work-related benefits. What they're trying to do, as I understand it, is they call it bend that curve. If trends continue as they are, it'll be 70 billion, and they're going to try and make that 70 billion number probably about 65 billion. How you get there is complicated and difficult. But is it necessarily the same thing you would do if you were... So you're trying to save the money up front in a way that scores on the forecast in 2 weeks' time. That's one thing. But if you were in fact trying to do a reform that paid for itself by getting people back into work, would you have done it the same way? These are two different things. They're trying to sort of merge them together. And this is why the detail will matter.
Yeah.
And it's actually the same reason why we were talking about one of the reasons why this merge is happening on the NHS is that they save several thousand headcount jobs. That's hundreds of millions of pounds that is scored. And so there is a big question here, which I think will be increasingly asked by Labour MPs, is the tail wagging the dog here? Are we, in fact, ideally we'd be paying a lot less money out in disability-related benefits because everyone would be working. We'd find appropriate jobs for people. They wouldn't feel the need to claim in the first place. But is that the driver here? Is it top-down or bottom-up, the driver here?
This is making me think three things. And Vicky, you can pick which one you want to think about. One, we're now into a conversation about these fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves has are supposed to help her because they're meant to give her credibility and a guide to how to manage the public finances that she thinks is electorally beneficial because it makes her look responsible. Are we now in a world where actually they're a problem rather than a help? Then the second thing is, historically, saving money on benefits has been really hard because actually the world keeps turning and actually reform is expensive, and actually George Osborne tried to save loads of money on benefits, didn't hit the targets at all. And then the third thing is, which I can now hopefully remember, it's like this is even before we're spending extra new money on defence, because the extra money that's been on defence thus far has been taken from the foreign aid budget. This isn't like actually where do we save money to give more to defence?
Yeah.
You can pick one of the three.
Well, no, I'm going to merge a few of them.
Okay, multiple choice.
But interesting, George Osborne actually has been talking about how he tried to reform PIP and it just couldn't do it. It was just too controversial. So it'd be interesting if
because Ian Duncan Smith resigned.
Yeah. So if the Labour government goes down that route. You talk about the defence spending. I think the interesting thing here is about the debate in the Labour Party. Now, there's a difference between MPs being really quite irritated and coming up and telling us they're very annoyed, and a mass full-on rebellion where they, say they're not going to vote for it. But if you look at a few of the people, say Annalisa Dodds, so she had obviously her ODA, but overseas aid budget taken away from her. She resigns, and then in her letter talks about how the party has got to think much more broadly about how you do this, because you can't just keep taking bits from here and there, slashing budgets. You've got to think about something else. She talks about a wealth tax. That was raised by Richard Bergen, who is of the left of the party. That was raised in Prime Minister's Questions this week. So I wonder whether that's what's going to happen. If you're having to then find loads of money for defence as well, it's not going to be enough just to try and raid all these other budgets potentially.
Adam, you're very sharp this evening, just saying, I'm thinking three thoughts, and I can exclusively reveal, because I'm sitting next to Adam, he didn't write that down. That was all off the top of his head.
Yeah, that's why, though, when I got to the third point, it's like, never say how many points you're going to make.
It was very impressive. But what I was going to say, one interesting thing that we sort of haven't mentioned that is at the heart of all this is COVID. So in the letter that was written by 36 Labour MPs supporting Liz Kendall, now 35, because one MP took her signature off it, they talked about, if I've remembered this correctly, that we are the only G7 country that has not got back to pre-COVID levels of out of work, and that essentially there is a huge legacy of what has happened as a result of COVID. And the big idea that Jeremy Hunt, the former Chancellor, Conservative former Chancellor, is talking about is he's saying if you could get the benefits bill back to where it was pre-COVID, he estimates that eventually that would save you £40 billion a year. And he's talking about that. That is big bucks, but what are the big social consequences of doing that?
Well, basically a social decision as to whether the areas of growth, he's basically saying that's the difference between the 30 billion I talked to in 29 and the 70 billion and where it's heading to. So you basically assume all of those new entrants onto the incapacity benefit system, that do you take it away from them? Do you all the future claimants as well? That is quite tricky. But I think that decisions need to be made. Does the state pay for this? When the incapacity benefits system was created, it was for physical disabilities.
Well, what I was going to say in my very magisterial summing up of this section of Newscast, because we have to move on to something else, is that it's just a reminder that we're living with a benefit system that we've kind of inherited from the 1980s, and then a planning system, which is something else the government tried to reform this week, that we inherited from the 1940s. And it just feels quite weird to me that here we are in 2025 talking about all these issues, and the tools we've got to address them are from the 1980s and the 1940s. No disrespect to anyone born in those eras or producing music in those eras, but it just feels quite weird to me that's where we're at. Right. Last thing we're going to talk about, Trump's tariffs. And actually, finally, they came home to roost in the UK this week, because it was always been a sort of like, an exotic thing that affects Europe or Canada. But now it affects Britain because of the global tariff on everyone that produces steel and sends it to America.
It affects us, but then also they've had to make a decision. And they tried to get an exemption. The UK government's had to make a decision. They tried to get an exemption. They didn't get an exemption. But they didn't retaliate. They didn't retaliate because the bigger game here, it's still relatively, it's important for the steel industry, but it's still a relatively modest amount. We're talking hundreds of millions of pounds, not billions or tens of billions. The bigger game is what's happening right now, which is the process where the US is going to assess how much they want to reciprocate against various crimes against trade that they perceive. So that could be a big tariff that you already levy on American goods, but it could also be some other type of barrier, or it could be the digital services tax, or it could be VAT itself. And so in trying to stop that process for the UK, they've decided to just leave the steel and aluminium on the side. Now, the other thing that's happening is as the trade war sort of grows bigger, I think you're going to get other countries trying to look for international buddies to just try and focus the mind of the Americans. So I don't think this sort of quietly sipping your pint whilst everyone else has a massive fight. Its strategy is going to work.
Well, to coin a phrase, will Keir Starmer come under pressure to join a coalition of the willing against Trump's trade policy?
Yeah. Well, so our instinct will be to say no. And not, we'll discuss. I mean, it's all going off now. I mean, just before I came
in, out of date.
You've got Walmart now being hauled up before the Chinese because they're trying to avoid. Basically, it's going to cost American consumers, but the president believes it won't, and so he has to make that reality come true.
And Nick, I'm going to come to you in a minute for the musical finale because I want to see how you're going to get from Hamilton to this. But Vicki, how is Starmer's mission as the bridge between Europe and America and kind of getting the benefits of both actually working out? Because, okay, he probably had a bit of a win when it came to Ukraine because now the US and Ukraine are kind of more aligned than they were 2 weeks ago when they were falling out in the Oval Office. But equally, as Faisal was saying, he didn't manage to get a carve out for Britain from steel and aluminium tariffs. So actually the bridge has gone that
wobbly
this metaphor is not working. I wish I'd thought it through. But anyway, give me your take. Give me your take. Yeah, the wobbly bridge. How wobbly is the bridge?
And I think partly they're also assessing the fact that it's changing all the time as well. So partly the retaliation maybe not happening yet because it might be hoping that it changes, tomorrow. Who knows? So I think they're biding their time. And as you say, on Ukraine, there was on the peace talks, as it were, there was a lot of briefing going on about how instrumental the UK was behind the scenes, the role of some of the diplomats and some of the people in Number 10 about all of that. So they're still trying to, make sure that they've got a position when it comes to that. But, it can be thrown back in his face. And that is always the problem, isn't it, with Donald Trump? He'll say one thing one day and it could be completely different the next.
Right. Lin-Manuel what? Because that's Lin-Manuel Miranda, author of Hamilton.
Yeah, well, the room where it happened, I'm now saying the words of it. Yeah. So look, I always never go anywhere without this. It's an article on Fox News by Scott Bessent, who's the new Treasury
Of course.
Because it
Who never leave home without it.
And he points out that Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, who was one of Faisal's early contacts in his early career as an economics
inventor of the dollar.
There we are. He was a proponent of tariffs. Alexander Hamilton believed in tariffs. And in those days, that was a very, very, and almost the only way of raising taxes. But anyway, Scott Besson then explains why today tariffs can be a really good idea. And they're basically, he says, a weapon to deliver the political and economic goals that Donald Trump wants. And essentially, he's saying that globalization was meant to do two big things: bring China into the open, liberal, free trading world and ensure that you have lots of wonderful jobs in the United States. And he said globalization has failed to do that with China. And what you've had with the United States is jobs being outsourced to China and Mexico. So one of the ways you reverse that is you deploy Donald Trump's favourite word in the English language, tariffs. So there we are. That's how we get from tariffs to Alexander.
This argument, so many other jobs have been outsourced to America. All the Coca-Cola we buy, right? People used to buy their own soft drink or recreational drink. America has benefited hugely from globalization, and for some reason they've just decided to forget all of that. It's been the number one beneficiary of globalization. Now China did benefit, like as you say, but the Hamilton argument too. I mean, there was no federal income tax at that point. So, I mean, is that the world we're going back to? But you didn't sing. You didn't sing it. You didn't sing it.
Vicky, your task now is to make a Phantom of the Opera reference.
Or Wicked.
Or Wicked.
No.
And my job is to say, that's it for this episode of Newscast. I'm off to go and listen to some musicals.
What you're
now.
saying is sit down, you're rocking the boat.
Oh,
Guys and
dolls. Guys and dolls. Right. Okay. I would love to make a musical theatre podcast, but I'm paid to make a news podcast. And we've done that very well this evening. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.